The Associated Press has been counting votes and declaring winners in presidential elections since 1848, when General Agent Alexander Jones coordinated the count from his office at Broadway and Liberty Streets. On November 8, the morning after the election, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle reported that the few returns which came in last night by telegraph point with moral certainty to the success of General Zachary Taylor. The election that brought Abraham Lincoln to the presidency was the last in which the Pony Express was used to connect far-distant telegraph stations. In a dispatch from Fort Kearny, Nebraska, on December 11, 1860, the New York Times reported that the California Pony Express passed here at 5 o'clock this morning, delivering election returns from every county in California, showing Lincoln with 38,702 votes and Douglas with 38,060. The Transcontinental Telegraph replaced the ponies when it began operation in October 1861. As any journalist will tell you, there are few assignments more exciting than counting the vote on election night. In 1920, AP General Manager Melville Stone captured the disciplined frenzy that prevailed at headquarters. The moment the polls close, the counting begins. Associated Press men everywhere are gathering precinct returns and hurrying them to county headquarters, where they are hastily added and the totals for the county on presidential electors are wired to the state headquarters of the association. Counting the vote requires skill, but race calling is a fine art. As Election Day dawned in 1948, few gave President Harry Truman much chance of beating Governor Thomas Dewey of New York. Nationwide opinion polls conducted by Gallup and Roper showed Dewey the clear leader. So sure of Dewey winning was Arthur Sears Henning of the Chicago Tribune that he wrote the next day's lead declaring Dewey president while the votes were still being counted. Even when returns showed Truman running a much better race than expected, Henning assured nervous colleagues, "Oh, that's just nonsense. That's nonsense. Forget it. The AP is all wrong." The Tribune's first edition declaring Dewey defeats Truman was barely off the press when editors determined Henning had blown the call. The Tribune managed to pull most of the copies, but neglected the stack in its own lobby. There, the Chicago Herald-Examiner bought a pile that produced one of the most famous AP election photos of all time. Byron Rollins had captured a beaming Truman, the unlikely winner, holding up a copy of the Tribune's front page. In 2000, the AP resisted tremendous pressure to declare George W. Bush president, based on the results in Florida. On election night, Tuesday, November 7th, Washington Bureau Chief Sandy Johnson reasoned that the race was still too close to call. "We were stunned when the network started calling Florida for Bush," Johnson remembered. "Washington news editor David Pace and I thought they were crazy to call not just the state, but the presidency on such a close count." The AP was being doubly cautious because of what happened earlier in the night. The AP and the networks had jumped the gun and called Florida for Vice President Al Gore, the Democratic nominee. That call was soon pulled back, and the AP was going to make sure it didn't make that mistake again. The last network call was at 2:20 a.m., and AP kept staring at its numbers as members all over the country phoned to ask why it had not called the race. As it turns out, the presidency wasn't decided until a month later, when the U.S. Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision on December 12, 2000, blocked further manual recounts in Florida. It is the only time in history that AP has not called a winner in a presidential election. For Washington news editor David Pace, who has been covering elections for AP since 1978, the challenge for the 2016 race will be polling.
The whole survey business is in sort of a crisis situation now because, telephone polls have been the gold standard of polling of all kinds, and particularly election polling for years, because you can just get a random sample of telephone numbers. But with cell phones, nobody has. Residential lines are disappearing fast, and it's very expensive to do polling of cell phones because Congress has prohibited pollsters from calling cell phone numbers with auto dialers. They have to sit there and actually punch in the numbers. And the other thing that killed pollsters is caller ID. Nobody answers the phones anymore, particularly their cell phones, if it's not somebody that they know. So response rates on telephone polls have totally plummeted over the last 4 or 5 years. They're down in the single digits, 6-7%. You have similar problems with exit polls, but because a lot of the what I mentioned earlier, a lot of the absentee ballots in a state that's big enough we have to use telephone polls to measure those. So we're going to be very careful in relying on polling results to make calls in 2016.
Washington Bureau Chief Sally Busby officially signs off on the big races. In a recent interview, she acknowledges the burden she carries every 2 years.
I would absolutely say that the single most intimidating part of this job is the race calls. Not that you have a team of experts. You have David Pace, who has more expertise at this than almost anybody in the United States. You have committed race callers who do research and are very, you have good software tools. You have the vote count, which is the fundamental tool to help in race calling. But the responsibility of, we're going to do this, and if we screw up, it has real implications. That was, to me, the most intimidating part, by far, of taking on this job. And you just have to prepare. You just have to have good people who know what they're doing, who spend the research time to really get themselves trained to do this. And then you have to just, psych yourself up, know that you're confident, and be prepared on election night and just do it.
The wellspring of this kind of commitment is the people's right to know, a right that is rooted in the basic freedoms of speech and press. When AP counts the vote, it is fulfilling a public trust.